Alberta's premier looks to get the ball rolling on a major new pipeline. Layoffs at Imperial Oil rattle the province's energy sector. Plus a conversation with the director and producer of the documentary The Road Between Us. All that and more straight ahead on episode 36 of The Rob Breakenridge Show.
As I said, to work to build the coalition of partners who are going to be on board with this. But this is a Canada project, and this is a test of whether Canada works as a country. Because if we can't build with collaboration of the federal government and between provinces, if it's everybody gets to get their products going to market except Alberta, that's not a country. A country is one where we support each other. And I think Canadians are there, and I hope that we can get more and more politicians to get there too.
All right, welcome, friends, to the Rob Breakenridge Show. That, of course, was the voice of Alberta Premier Danielle Smith speaking at a press conference Wednesday, laying out the stakes when it comes to the future of pipeline development in Canada. It's a test of whether Canada is a country. There was so much pinned on the hope of a new pipeline, not just the economic hopes that are pinned on a major new pipeline project, but the political symbolism of a new pipeline project. And in a lot of ways, this could have a huge impact on the conversation and the debate around Alberta's future. So on Wednesday, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, as mentioned, holding this press conference to announce next steps in trying to get that new pipeline built. Now, I'll say this. There certainly seems to be a willingness on the part of the federal government to entertain the idea of a new pipeline project. And amid everything Canada's going through at the moment and what the Major Projects Office was designed to do, this seems like an obvious one. The economic impact that building a major new pipeline could have, that's pretty huge. And it sounds like this Prime Minister is open to that. In fact, just recently when you had the Prime Minister in Edmonton announcing the Major Projects Office, and he had that meeting with Alberta Premier Smith, the two seem very much on the same page about all of this. And in fact, the Premier spoke very highly of that meeting. She sounded very excited and very bullish about where this was all going. So it was interesting to hear those two different sides from the Premier at this press conference on Wednesday. On the one hand, that same spirit of optimism, that same sort of hope and bullishness about where things are going, but then also turning it a little bit on its head, saying, if this doesn't happen, we got some big problems on our hands. And the stakes are high, and this is a test for Canada. Now, it's still very early on in this process. This is really just the Alberta government announcing that it intends to lead an application for a new pipeline. The plan isn't that Alberta would build or pay for a new pipeline, but Alberta is sort of leading the way to get some of these procedural matters dealt with, and the hope is then that the private sector will kind of take it from there. I think the hope, too, was that there would be some substantial Indigenous involvement in this project, and that was conveyed at this press conference on Wednesday. So for now, Alberta's going to lead what they're calling a technical advisory group. There is a price tag of about $14 million for this stage of the process. Alberta is going to cover that. And so now there's going to be some work involved in laying out what this project could actually look like. And from there, it would then go to the Major Projects Office. And it was interesting, too, because the Premier talked about having a proposal for that office by May, but then also talking about a much quicker timeline and having something to announce by Grey Cup. Now, remember, the Prime Minister has talked about the next batch or the next phase of major projects being announced at or by Grey Cup. And I guess the Premier is hoping that there is something that could be announced on this front here. So the ball's very much in Ottawa's court, I guess, and where things go from here. But of course, there is still some work to do in having an actual proposal for the federal government to decide on. Now, there is still the BC factor in all of this. Now, British Columbia doesn't have the authority or the jurisdiction, as we learned in the Trans Mountain debate, to say no to or to block a pipeline. But if BC intends on obstructing or challenging or just otherwise trying to be a problem for such a project, that could hamper things. That could be a problem. And so that would be an obstacle to be overcome, in addition to whatever other obstacles and opposition there is, and certainly there will be some. But again, that's still a little bit down the road. Here's what BC Premier David Eby, though, had to say in response to Danielle Smith's announcement.
Neighbourly relations are crucial between Alberta and British Columbia. And that's a relationship that needs to go both ways. British Columbia has literally tens of billions of dollars of real private sector shovel-ready projects that are going to drive forward not just our economy here in BC, but the national economy at a time that the national economy is under direct threat and attack by Donald Trump. Now, the problem that we have is that Premier Smith continues to advance a project that is entirely taxpayer funded, has no private sector proponent, is not a real project, and is incredibly alarming to British Columbians, including First Nations along the coast, whose support is required for the success of the billions of dollars in real projects that I'm talking about. We need a major projects office at the federal level, not a major distractions office, not a major politics office, but an office that advances real shovel-ready projects that will move this economy forward in British Columbia and nationally. And what I am seeing from Alberta directly threatens that. So I am all for working closely with Alberta on electrical intertie that's going to drive down electrical rates for Alberta consumers. On the hydrogen sector, that is, we both need the federal government to assist us with getting hydrogen to market to build that economy. On other major infrastructure projects and projects that have real private sector backing that aren't entirely taxpayer-funded wedge politics.
Okay, so I do want to talk more about this pipeline proposal, where this is all going. There was also some news this week that I want to tie into the conversation. It was the announcement earlier this week by Imperial Oil that they'll be reducing about 20% of their workforce. And that's going to mean about almost 900 jobs in Calgary are going to be gone. And you think, 20 years ago, how things were then, as Imperial Oil moved its head office from Toronto to Calgary. Now, basically, they're going to be out of Calgary. Now, Imperial Oil is still doing well. Their production is at or near record highs, but they're shedding staff. And there has been a trend in the industry in recent years to be able to produce more, but to do so with fewer workers. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to, especially if we're hoping that more development, more production can be the answer to our burgeoning unemployment crisis. So joining us for more on these two important issues, very pleased to welcome to the program here Energi journalist Markham Hislop. He's CEO at Energi Media, much more at energi.media. That's Energy with an I. Markham, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Rob.
Let's start with this pipeline announcement. I mean, it's been pretty clear that obviously Alberta's been pushing for this. I think the new prime minister and his government seem at least open to exploring this. But what did you make of the announcement this week?
I have to tell you, I was just on CKNW in radio in Vancouver, and my message was, British Columbia, get ready for a pipeline. Because... Yeah. And I'll tell you why. The tell for me is the fact that of this technical advisory group, which has a number of industry veterans, there's like 9 or 10 of them. It has 3 pipeline companies, and it has a bunch of indigenous groups as well. But it has 3 pipeline companies. So, of course, familiar names to Calgarians. Enbridge, of course, which was a proponent for Northern Gateway back 10 years ago, and then Southbow, which is TC Energy's liquids pipeline division, and then Trans Mountain Corporation, which is a federal crown corporation. Yep. And it built the Trans Mountain expansion from Edmonton to Burnaby. And so obviously it has technical expertise in running and building a pipeline, but nothing compared to what Enbridge would have, all the work that it had done in the past, designing the route to Kitimat and evaluating a potential route to Prince Rupert. All of that's really valuable work for this particular group. Trans Mountain Corporation doesn't bring much to the table, but there's no way that it sits there without the Prime Minister's say-so. Every Crown corporation, regardless of who owns it, a province or federal government, is beholden to its shareholder. And so the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office knows very well they're involved in this. And I personally, because we don't know this, but this is my speculation based on what we do know. I think it's there because essentially the government wants it to go through, wants the pipeline to be approved. And it might be an Indigenous group that ends up being the proponent. It might be Enbridge or Southbow. It might even be Trans Mountain Corporation. But the government wants eyes and ears at the table because it also has pots of money that it can invest. It can empower the Indigenous communities. It can invest on its own. It can backstop Trans Mountain Corp. There's a lot of way this cat can be skinned, and so that it's at the table, so it knows what's going on, and the Prime Minister knows what's going on. That's my take.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it makes a lot of sense, given the signals we've seen. I mean, just a few weeks ago, right? And you had this meeting between the Premier and the Prime Minister, and, the way Danielle Smith was gushing about how that went and this new relationship between Alberta and Ottawa. There certainly seem to be those signals that things are trending in this direction. Is that your read?
It is, and I'm gonna give you another data point for why I think that this is the Prime Minister is backing this. But first of all, I want to say, because this is not well understood in Alberta. You and I have been around this game long enough. We remember Danielle Smith from her Calgary Board of Education days and her days leading the Wild Rose Party. She was pretty raw and made a lot of mistakes, I would say. But when she came back as Premier and leader of the UCP, I would say that she has grown strategically, politically. She's much more astute than she was at that. She doesn't misstep very often. She's the right person for the times in Alberta, and her communication skills, I think, have improved a great deal. And so it's not understood in BC how effective she is at this kind of work. So that's number one. But the second thing I wanted to say is that you remember early on when Mark Carney became Prime Minister, and what did he say? Canada has the reputation of not being able to build anymore. We don't build anymore in Canada. Too much regulation, too much NIMBYism, too much of whatever. And he needs desperately to send a message to the investment community that Canada is again open for business. And because the oil and gas industry did such a good job of owning Canada's broken narrative, then the oil and gas industry has kind of become the poster child. If you can make them happy, if you can get a project approved, and the folks come to the table, they're well financed, they can build it. The message then to the investment community, Bay Street, Wall Street, whoever it is this guy's serious. Carney has got it going on. He's got the right strategy. Yeah, okay, we feel comfortable now moving in and investing in ports and copper mines and whatever else he's got on the table. So I think this is it's a symbol to the investment community of whether Mark Carney can pull this off. And if he can't, where's he going to get the private capital from to do all these other projects that he's got, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that are required? And if the private sector isn't comfortable, it won't invest. So between those, Trans Mountain Corporation being on the advisory group and the impetus for Mark Carney to get this approved for investors, for me, it's a compelling argument.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too. I mean, both the Premier and the Prime Minister have spoken before about this idea of a grand bargain, which would involve some trade-off through carbon capture, the Pathways Project. We didn't hear a lot about it in the Premier's announcement this week, but is there still a pretty clear link here between the two?
Well, this is... how can you do a grand bargain when the federal government is going to be paying 2/3 of the bill to decarbonize the oil sands? I mean, you'll remember when this was first floated, the Pathways Alliance back in 2021 or 2022, and I remember Alex Pourbet, the former CEO of Cenovus, saying in the media at that time, it's going to cost $75 billion to decarbonize the oil sands. We expect government, mostly the federal government, to come up with $50 billion of that. And they've already put in $8 billion of investment tax credits in the first phase of it, which only captures 10 to 12% of those GSGs. So there's a big bill coming, and the federal government, if it's serious about lowering those oil sands emissions, then they're going to have to drag out the big red checkbook in a big way. So, is it a grand bargain when the benefit to the prime minister is to lower emissions, for which he's going to pay anyway?
Yeah. But it seems that there's sort of the three factors. And I think on the environmental side, that would be one way of Carney showing that he's still serious. There's the Indigenous aspect, and that was front and center in the Premier's press conference. That's going to be a big factor. And then there's BC. And we hear the comments this week from BC's Premier. He's obviously not enthusiastic, to say the least, about this. Harkens back to some of the debate around Trans Mountain and a previous BC Premier. So what do you read into that? How much of a factor is that going to be?
2016 to 2019, I spent a lot of time reporting on the construction of Trans Mountain expansion when Kinder Morgan was in charge. And I can't tell you how many National Energy Board rulings I had to read. And one of the things that became very clear is that, first of all, it was the city of Burnaby was being obstructionist, dragging their feet on permits, that kind of thing. And then when the NDP won in BC in 2017, they then challenged it in court, and it was a full court press between Burnaby and BC and Victoria. And this is not well understood, but under Canadian legislation, the government exercises its constitutional authority on linear infrastructure works that cross provincial borders through the regulator. And the regulator is actually a superior court. It can rule on constitutional issues as a court. And it did twice. And it upheld the federal government's exclusive authority to approve or disapprove pipelines that cross provincial borders. And that's why the BC government and the city of Burnaby both lost. I think they went as high as the BC Supreme Court, and they lost every time. Mm-hmm. So my message to Mike Smith this morning and Vancouverites was, it doesn't matter that First Nations oppose. It doesn't matter that David Eby doesn't like it. If the prime minister decides that he wants this, as Trudeau did, if right. The federal government says yes, you don't have the whip hand here. He does, and if he decides to use it, you will have a pipeline, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah. It will be interesting to see. I mean, there is still the tanker ban that's in place, and maybe, with this additional power that the Major Projects Office and the Building Canada Act, that they can kind of get around that perhaps, or do you think it's going to have to come to scaling back some of this legislation?
See, this is the thing, and I don't understand why Carney and his energy minister, Tim Hodgson, have been so bullish on a pipeline or expanding the oil sands and all of that. And, every time he comes to Calgary, he gets in the media and they talk about how, great talks, the industry love us, we're all doing really well, because there were all of these downstream issues that, like the Environmental Assessment Act, we got what was then C-48, the oil tanker ban, the emissions cap, on and on and on. And you knew if you advance the pipeline, you then had to fill it up with dilbit from the oil sands. And so all of these other legislative areas would have to be tackled, and some of them were going to be really unpopular, like the tanker ban. But how does Smith put in an application as the proponent? Alberta puts in the application, and then Carney says, well, sorry, we can't overturn the tanker ban. We're going to have to. The politics of that, the optics of that are so awful that you've got to think that there's a compromise to make that happen. Otherwise, he would not have gone down this far down the road, unless he's made a political miscalculation. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? Maybe he did, but he's a pretty clever guy. I don't think so. So
that's true. I want to factor in the Imperial Oil thing. And it's interesting because of all the economic hopes that are pinned on a project like this. And there's economic activity and government revenue associated with this, as we saw with Trans Mountain. But the question of jobs. And if we're going to increase production in Alberta's oil sands or the oil sector, does that necessarily mean that there's going to be more jobs that come along with that extra production?
No. And this is the red flag that we've been raising over here at Energi Media. And the reason for that is because digital technology was adopted by other sectors like manufacturing as long ago as 20 years. Oil and gas was late to the game, but they're adopting it en masse now. So, and digital technologies can be anything from AI in the head office to camera and sensors out on batteries, oil batteries, to drones flying pipelines. I mean, all of that. And so this has been going on now for a few years, and it's really starting now. You can see it in the oil sands from 2005 to 2025, production tripled. At the same time, oil and gas employment in Alberta fell by 33,000 workers. So yeah, I can foresee a future where, of course, there'll be construction jobs, but after those are done, you could see the oil sands production continue to increase at the same time as the industry adopts all of this, labor-saving technology, and either keeps the number of workers the same, or they even continue to fall. So, and this is a trend you see in oil fields all over the world.
Well, the U.S. too. Yeah, it's not uniquely Canadian. Right. I mean, there was a New York Times piece earlier this year, same thing, right? I think employment overall in oil and gas is down 25% over the last decade, but production again in the U.S. at record levels. So, as you say, we're seeing this across the industry.
And you know what? We shouldn't be surprised. I mean, this is what mature industries do, right? And I've interviewed energy economist Kevin Byrne from S&P Global. He's been interviewing him for a decade about the oil sands. And he makes this point that, the construction basically stopped in 2015. All the projects were, I think Imperial Oil's Curl was the last one. And then once they got their feet under them, the next thing they did was look for efficiencies and look for ways to debottleneck so that without spending a lot of capital, you could increase your production. And they've been getting better and better and better. It was not that long ago that we were using Rystad Energy and other estimates for, like a $40 to $50 WTI break even for the oil sands. And then I interviewed Kevin and he said, no. We're talking about an average of $27 and as low as 18 and as high as 45, but an average of $27, which is a very low break even. And so suddenly now we have to understand that the oil sands has become a very, very efficient processing operation. And so, the costs are down, and they've done it by using, well, I'll give you an example. So I interviewed a millwright who worked for, I forget which company. And he said he used to go around to the various buildings and he would check the pumps and what have you. And he would have to write out a report, and then the report would be mailed off, or he'd enter it into his computer, whatever it was. And then they went to barcodes, and all he did was go around with an iPad or an iPhone and a scanner. And then the data would be automatically uploaded to a cloud, and the data would be crunched out of Calgary. And he said, Markham, I went from doing, one or two of these inspections a day to doing, 8 or 10. And so we laid off some of the inspectors. We just didn't need as many. So you see that in autonomous ore haulers, that's companies like Suncor use. You see it in remote sensing on oil and gas batteries. It's just all over the industry now. And so it's just the way of the world.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, Imperial Oil, it's not like they're in dire straits. They just had their latest quarterly numbers. Yeah. For the second quarter, I think they said it was their highest overall production quarter in 30 years. The Curl Oil Sands Mine Project, it was the most production in the second quarter ever. So they're busy. They're increasing production, but at the same time, they're shedding staff, right?
I'm often, when I talk to audiences outside of Alberta, the perception there is that the bitumen is a dirty, sludgy, lowest quality kind of product, and it's very high cost to produce. and there's no market, nobody wants it. None of those things are true. I mean, yes, it's a heavy sour crude, but their break-even costs are low, and there's demand for it because down in the U.S., they've got 5.5 million barrels a day of refining capacity that was built exactly for that crude. And it's cheap. So it's got a coker, it's got a hydrocracker, and they buy it for $20 or $15, whatever it is, less than WTI, and they can make more money. And they can make more sort of distillates kind of stuff like bunker C or aviation. So there's 10 million barrels a day of capacity globally. So in North America, the Alberta bitumen is the most competitive barrel of all the barrels in the world. Mexico, Venezuela, doesn't matter. We're the cheapest, we're the best, we're the most dependable, all of that stuff. And that is not the perception outside of Alberta, but that's what the data says.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, the climate right now with all the geopolitical uncertainty and what's sort of weighing down the price of oil. I know it's a little bit of a different calculation here because we've got the differential to factor in if we can get to export markets. But I just wonder about these big investment decisions, big decisions about increasing production. How much uncertainty is there right now?
An incredible amount. So for those folks who aren't familiar with our journalism, we do a lot of energy transition work. We're kind of, we do half of the 500 or so interviews that I do in a year are with global experts, folks in the US or Europe or Asia. And it's an entirely different world out there, led by China, but also embraced by other Asian nations like India and Malaysia and Pakistan and so on. They're busy electrifying. And you take China, everybody knows that, 58% of the new cars this year are going to have a plug. And that's already displacing oil. China has reached peak oil demand already ahead of schedule. So here we are gearing up, talking about a pipeline, and we're going to send 1 million barrels a day off to Asia at the very time that they're electrifying the sectors that would be the customers for that oil. And the thing, it's very disruptive. It's very uncertain. And we should what I would like to see is that we acknowledge the risk. But instead, what we've got is Premier Danielle Smith, the industry CEOs, the Prime Minister, the Federal Energy Minister are just bullish. All they talk about is how fantastic it is, a great opportunity. But when you look at the data over there and you talk to experts about what's going on, you read Chinese oil demand modeling, which is a real eye-opener, I can tell you. It's a completely different story. And my greatest fear, Rob, is that we are not calculating risk properly. That's the key.
Well, we'll leave it on that note. Much ahead, of course, much more at Energi Media, Energi.media, Energi, Energi. Markham, thank you so much for making some time for us here. Really appreciate the insight.
Well, thanks for having me, Rob.
All right, there you go. That was Markham Hislop, energy journalist, CEO at Energi Media, Energi.media. Again, that's Energi with an I. I did want to play one more clip from the Premier. This was at a press conference on Tuesday talking about the teacher strike, but she was being asked about the situation at Imperial Oil. And the Premier conceding the point that we were talking about, where you've got a situation in the oil sands, these big companies, they're able to produce more and to do so with fewer workers.
It seems like they've been able to increase production, but that doesn't necessarily have the same amount of jobs as it used to in the past. I mean, some of the big oil sands operations are able to dramatically increase production using the same workforce. Where we really got the increase in jobs was through all of the drilling in conventional oil and gas. And as the industry has moved further and further north, that's, I think, some of the consolidation that we've seen. So I'm not concerned about our future prospects overall if we can get the policy environment right. I absolutely believe, looking at some of the future projections about where the demand for oil and gas growth is going to be, that there's an incredible future for people who want to be able to work in this sector. But it will require growth, and we only will get growth if we can address the 9 bad laws that have been interfering with the investment climate and get some new pipelines built.
Okay, so that was the premier on Tuesday. Wednesday is when the big pipeline announcement was made. Monday was the final town hall, in-person town hall for the Alberta Next panel. And certainly, what we saw Wednesday does tie in with everything around the Alberta Next panel, the idea that we need to get a better deal with Ottawa. But for all these other issues being talked about, a lot of it does come down to energy, and especially a pipeline. And I guess if there is no pipeline, well, maybe that's where some of these other issues become a little bit more relevant. So we'll see what comes out of the Alberta Next panel. But there was one big controversy that did come from what happened Monday night at that town hall in Calgary. We'll touch on that in just a second. You're listening to the Rob Breakenridge Show. Okay, so Monday was the last in-person town hall for the Alberta Next panel, which has been traveling across the province, holding these town hall meetings. But to what end? I think that's been one of the questions around all of this. Why are we doing it again when under Jason Kenney we had the Fair Deal panel? But otherwise, what is the point of all of this? Now, we may get the answer in the months ahead, depending on what the Alberta government takes from this or what they intend to do. The Premier has indicated there is an intention to put various questions to a referendum to Albertans, so perhaps there are some ballot measures we'll be voting on next year, maybe on things like an Alberta pension plan or provincial police force or things along those lines. But really, essentially, it seems like it's been a venting session, and maybe there's something to that. I think Albertans feel like their voices are being heard. I think one of the frustrations coming out of the federal election was the sense that our voices aren't being heard. Once again, Alberta voted one way, but it didn't really matter because the rest of the country, or enough of the rest of the country, voted another way. So Alberta doesn't seem to get the kind of outcome or the government it chooses. So I think that's where some of this frustration comes from, that we vote one way, the rest of the country votes another. And so decisions are being made that we really feel like maybe we have no say over. And so I think these, as we talked about on the last podcast, the idea of Alberta making decisions in certain realms where Alberta voters can feel like maybe the people making the decisions are more accountable to them. They're in a position to change those people if they don't like the decisions being made. There's a lot of appeal to that. Now, whether that translates into support for a provincial police force or a pension plan or some of these other ideas, I guess remains to be seen. But it's also been noted that these have not really necessarily been objective sort of come on in, let's hear everybody, let's hear different perspectives sort of town hall meetings. And a lot of it's been geared at driving public opinion as opposed to listening to public opinion. A lot of the videos that are shown at these town halls do seem a little skewed on some of these issues that are presented to folks. And it, conveys that maybe the Alberta government has its mind made up on a few things. But then there's the tone of these meetings as driven by the moderator, Bruce McAllister, a former broadcaster. He works in the Premier's office. He's not technically on the panel, but he's there as a moderator. And again, he's a pretty important person within the Premier's circle. And just how combative he has been at times with folks who show up to these meetings but ask questions that are more critical of the government. And this maybe gives away a little bit of the game here. One of the advantages for the UCP and the way that the federal election turned out is they have a convenient scapegoat in the Liberal government. And really, there's a long history of that in Alberta, I think, with Conservative provincial governments using the federal Liberal government as a political punching bag. So that's how a lot of the conversation has been shaped in the aftermath of the election. Let's talk about Ottawa. If there's anything bad happening in Alberta, it must be Ottawa's fault. Anything good happening in Alberta, well, the provincial government can take credit. And so that's kind of spilled over, I think, into these Alberta Next panels, where there's a real palpable sense of frustration in anybody who shows up and isn't there to criticize Ottawa. That anybody dare question or say anything critical of the provincial government, they don't want to hear that. That's not what this is for. This is supposed to be about complaining about Ottawa, not complaining about the Alberta government. But sometimes it's just a little too blatant. So that was part of what happened Monday night at this Calgary town hall, but not just the dismissive tone from the moderator, but the actual comment that was made. So look, this was the same night that the Alberta Teachers Association announced that their members had rejected this offer, that they're headed toward a strike on October 6th. And so there was a young person who was there who wanted to raise the issue. Now, I can maybe sort of understand trying to keep things relatively focused. People are going to get up to the mic and raise different issues. But it just seems a little selective in what they get upset about. So if someone's critical of the federal government, it seems like they get a lot of leeway. Someone who's there to criticize the Alberta government, not so much. So this young man who's a high school student, and grade 12 by the sounds of it, who obviously would be very worried about the impact of a teacher's strike, given that it's his final year of high school, got up to ask a question on a pretty relevant issue, timely issue, and had his microphone cut off. And then Bruce McAllister, the moderator, suggesting that this young man needed to be spanked by his parents. Here was that exchange.
Hi, my name is Evan Lee. I'm a Calgary high school student. Like many high school students, I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to the upcoming Alberta teachers' strike. But just an hour ago, they voted 89.5 in favor of striking.
Evan?
And my question is, why is the government handing out
Here's the thing, Evan. Evan, I applaud you coming here to speak. I don't applaud how you're trying to speak. It's not making any sense. So we're going to move along, okay? Let's go over to this microphone, okay? I know you'd love some chaos, but your parents should turn you over your knee. Let's go over here.
Oh, that's rude. That's rude. No. Rude.
Go ahead.
That is disgraceful.
Okay, so wow. You can even hear the reaction for a lot of folks there. Like, that really crossed the line. It was weird to see the premier and the rest of the panel just kind of sitting there. No one on the panel really reacted. Now, Bruce McAllister did later post an apology on social media. The premier was asked about it. She just referred back to his apology and said that was that. So I don't know if anything really is going to come of this. I think the coverage of this, or maybe a lot of people not following the Alberta Next panel, then to hear about this controversy, what happened, how this all went down, to see and hear that, might leave a bad taste in the mouths of a lot of people, and just sort of reinforces this notion that this isn't really about listening to Albertans. It's about trying to drive a certain agenda, and someone who dares to question that agenda or get in the way of that agenda just kind of gets metaphorically run over. So it doesn't play well, I don't think, with a lot of middle-of-the-road folks who maybe aren't following all of this very closely. Certainly doesn't reflect well on the moderator. The way he got his back up, that someone dared to ask about this. And I mean, look, if he had just said, hey, we're sticking to these topics, we're going to move on to somebody else, probably wouldn't have got as much attention. So to cut the guy's mic off so quickly, and then to say what he said, yeah, that's going to get a lot of attention, as it should. So not a great shining moment for the Alberta Next panel, especially as it wraps up its work and is now trying to convince Albertans that this was a useful exercise and that something productive is going to come from all of this. Like I say, the Alberta government has some decisions to make about what they take from this and what next steps are. But a bit of a black eye for the process this week. All right, we got one more interview for you on this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Coming up in a moment, we're going to be joined by the director and the producer of a documentary called The Road Between Us, The Ultimate Rescue, which has nationwide release, in fact, North American release, on Friday, October 3rd. Now, this is a documentary that had its premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival, and I suspect that's where a lot of you probably heard about it for the first time, because it was pulled from the festival. Only to later be reinstated. Actually went on to win the People's Choice Award at the festival. And it is, in a way, a documentary about the terror attack of October 7th, which I suppose it's unavoidable that that's going to be political. Now, the film isn't meant to be political. The film actually really tells kind of a narrow story of one family and one rescue on that fateful day. And it is a very compelling film in that sense. So we'll find out a bit more about this documentary, about some of the reaction it's received, and what it is the director and producer want people to take from this. So we'll talk about The Road Between Us up next on The Rob Breakenridge Show.
Around 7 and 10 minutes, we began to hear gunfire. And at 7:15, we hear it right outside of our window. And I'm looking in a mirror and I'm telling him, they're here.
Well, that is from the trailer for the documentary film The Road Between Us, The Ultimate Rescue, a film that has its nationwide release on Friday, October 3rd. Now, this is a documentary that received a lot of attention as a result of what happened at the Toronto International Film Festival. As mentioned, the festival actually pulled the film. That generated a huge backlash against the festival. It was ultimately reinstated and, in fact, went on to win the People's Choice Award. Now, this is a story about what happened on October 7th, 2023, the Hamas terror attack on Israel. But it's not a movie about the terror attack. It's not a movie about the conflict. Ultimately, it's a story of one family and a desperate attempt to stage a rescue as the terror attack was unfolding. So that's the focus of this film. So I want to talk more about the film, the story, the reaction to all of this. So we're very pleased to welcome to the Rob Breakenridge Show Barry Avrich. He's director and co-producer, and Mark Selby, who is producer of The Road Between Us, The Ultimate Rescue. Much more at theroadbetweenus.com. Barry, Mark, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rob. Pleasure to be here.
Great to see you.
So let's talk about the origins of this film and how this all came about and your connection, of course, with the Israeli general whose family is at the center of this story. Where did this project begin, first of all?
Mark and I love telling great stories. And as documentary filmmakers, we've got this giant wall in our office with lots and lots of stories we're developing. And someone had sent me a story, one of the stories coming out of October 7th of this. Everything was so dark and tragic. And then suddenly there's this story, this rescue story. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then the next day, Sunday, 60 Minutes, and Noam Thibon's on 60 Minutes recounting the story. And what I loved about him was that he told the story through the lens of a father. I'm a father. I appreciated that. And he was also a good storyteller. And so I reached out to him immediately, thinking that we'd be 12 or 13th in row behind everybody else from Hollywood to get the story told. And we were, but we had a good chemistry. And he said to me something that you never want to hear as a filmmaker. You'll have to speak to my daughter-in-law. She's an agent. So that began that bit of a dance, because at the same time they were negotiating what's called the scripted rights, the fiction account of this film. And so we had to sort of get them to understand that a documentary, I think, is an essential part of the storytelling. And that we did. And Noam, Mark, and I spent a lot of time on Zooms with Noam preparing for this before we went to Israel to film.
Mark, what drew you to this story then?
I don't think it's unfair to say as a Jewish person, I feel somewhat connected to that part of the world. But I think it's this story of heroism in the midst of this unspeakable tragedy. And our focus in the story was to keep it on Noam Thibon, the retired Army general who, with his wife, Gali, drove into the line of fire to rescue their family in the midst of this horror. So, we wanted to keep it on that. It's not a political film. There's some politics inherent just in the time and place where it's set. We understand that. However, when you see the film, you realize that we keep the story very focused on this one piece of this one item about this one family from that terrible day.
Yeah, as you say, it's not a political film. I think the aftermath of the conflict has become very political, and even some of the conversation around the film itself and what happened at TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, did become political. So what was your reaction, I mean, in particular to what happened at TIFF and just how this became such a political story?
We didn't, we knew that there would be heat in the story and in the making of the film. We never anticipated the film festival decision that they made, nor the global reaction to this. This was not only the community that stood up, but media, the Hollywood community, emails, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails. I still haven't gone through all of them, that basically said this film should not be erased. A film festival should be about the balance of programming. How is this decision made? So, the film got cast in a global spotlight, and it became the fight of our lives to get it back in. And there were many sort of validating moments along the way since the film was put back in.
Yeah, Mark, your thoughts and just the reaction to the film once it was brought back in.
Well, the reaction to the people that were in that room in Roy Thompson Hall at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 10th, the reaction was extremely positive. There were 2 standing ovations, and we could not have been more thrilled. And it was very gratifying after that whole process to see that. The reaction outside the theater, there were, not a lot of protesters, but they were very loud, protesting a film that they had not seen and probably won't, because that's generally how it works. But, it's frustrating and upsetting, because they I think if they watched the film, they would find some common ground with the subject matter, with the subjects in the film, but it's not something I think they'll be interested in doing. It's sad and it's unfortunate that this was the only film that really had to endure that kind of level of disruption and that level of security in order to ensure that it was a safe screening for everyone. But, as Barry has said before, this is the world that we're living in at the moment. But the reaction that day was great. They are currently the only people who have seen the film as of the time that we're recording this. The film, of course, is coming out Friday, October 3rd, and it will finally be seen on cinema screens across Canada and the United States. Prior to TIFF, the only people who had seen it was a very, very small handful of press that we invited to a very small private screening. And the overwhelming response that we got after that screening was 2 things. One was people were very impressed with the film itself. The quality of the film they thought was very good. But the other thing they all kept saying is, wow, it's really not political, is it? And that was the point we've been trying to tell people, is it really is not. That is not the point of the film. And so I hope once people do have a chance to see the film, and they'll be bringing people to see it who maybe are interested in the Middle East and the conflict, and they'll see this perspective that is, important to understand. And it really is universal in its sense of family.
Exactly. Even if you're not interested, you've had enough of politics. So the National Post got it right, saying, forget the politics. This film is a thriller. And as a father and a father to be, you can't stop thinking about what would you do every time you send your children out in the world. What would you do if you got that text message?
Yeah. It's interesting. One aspect of the film, and this became sort of a focus in the controversy, is, when TIFF initially suggested something about, footage not being cleared or not having permission, it was sort of a weird way to frame what was the Hamas body cam footage from that day. But it sort of, that bigger issue speaks to the kind of digital world we live in, where so much of daily life, even when horrible things happen, it's documented. So tell this story, there's a lot there that you could draw from.
We wanted again to make the film through the lens of Noam Thibon and his wife. What did they see every step of the way, every kilometer they traveled? And so, this is the genius of Mark Selby and Dave Kennedy, our editor, who had access, and our visual researcher had access to, yes, the Hamas body cam footage, which was streamed globally, all of the security cameras on the Israeli highways, and the security cameras at the kibbutz that was attacked. So they painstakingly went through it. So if Noam Thibon and his wife stopped at a certain point to save someone, which they did several times during that day, or they were ambushed by terrorists, you saw it in real time that it was captured in. So, yes, that is the benefit in this Big Brother world we're living in. For the film festival to suggest that maybe the filmmakers, us, didn't seek the right clearances. It was so ludicrous, because I've made so many films, and, you do the best you can to clear footage. And I'm still not aware of a Hamas licensing division. So, onwards.
We're very selective in the footage that we use too. It's not gratuitous at all. It illustrates Noam's trajectory that day, every step of the way, as Barry says. And, what we use is used sparingly, but to illustrate the what he was up against that whole day. The the shocking thing to us that we learned really is we're very aware of what happened that day. And what we learned is that a lot of people were not. One of the requests that we had was to, on the film, to instruct the viewer to know when we're using live streamed Hamas body cam footage and not what they thought was a recreation. We did not recreate anything. We did not have actors in gear, recreating this. This is all of the moment. The only thing was Noam walking us through his day, cut together with the footage from October 7th.
Exactly.
But it was shocking when we found out that people did not know that the footage was live streamed, that all of this terrorist attack was available online for anyone to see. So for people to not be aware of that, it's doubly important for them to see this film.
I think what Mark was highlighting to finish that point is that, there was concern and suggestion that we would have hired thousands of actors, put them in Hamas costumes, and put them on motorcycles with RPGs and cast them to be in this film, which, again, it's a documentary. There are recreations that are done. Not this time.
And I mean, in a way, there are some political threads, I suppose, that come out of this, the horrors of what happened that day. And I know there's lingering questions about why wasn't more done to prevent this or the fact that it happened in the first place. So maybe some of that is unavoidable, but it's kind of the backdrop to this being released. Maybe, hopefully, we're on the verge of seeing some resolution, to this conflict that day spawned. So, with all of that in mind, I guess for people going into this, what ultimately do you want people to take from this, though?
This was such a dark day, and the days that followed in that region are incredibly dark and upsetting and frustrating. I want people to escape for 96 minutes and see a bright moment on that day of a family that was saved. And that's it. Think about that moment, concentrate on the family, spend more time with your own family, because the world changes instantly, constantly, and we can't reverse that. So it's just escape for 96 minutes and watch this incredible family and ask yourself the same question: what would you do if you got that text message?
Right, again, our thanks to Barry Avrich, director, Mark Selby, producer. The documentary is called The Road Between Us, The Ultimate Rescue. TheRoadBetweenUs.com is the film's website. As mentioned, Friday, October 3rd is the nationwide release. That's where we will leave it for this episode of The Rob Breakenridge Show. Our thanks as well to Markham Hislop, some interesting insight on everything going on in the Alberta energy sector and the debate around that sector's future. Don't forget to find us, follow us, subscribe at robbreakenridge.ca. Thank you so much for spending some time with us on this episode of the program. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, and we will talk to you next week. Take care.